picture the border in early June. The big leaf hydrangea beside your gate should be heavy with blue mophead flowers, each head the size of a grapefruit, nodding over the path. Instead, you get a green bush, leaves everywhere, and not one bloom among them. Here is the part that stings. The cut that erased those flowers happened last August, nearly 10 months earlier, the afternoon you took shears to that bed to tidy it. But the rule you have heard, never cut hydrangeas in August, is only half true, and the reason people give for it is usually wrong. Let me say the honest version out loud, because almost nobody does. Whether that August cut ruins your summer or costs you nothing at all depends entirely on one thing: which kind of wood your particular hydrangea flowers from. Get that single fact straight, and you will never fear the shears again. Miss it, and you can keep planting the same green disappointment for years without once realizing you did it to yourself. That last part is not theory for me. Before a family gathering one summer, feeling house proud, I sheared my own row of big leaf hydrangeas flat across the top, pleased with how neat the bed looked once the brown heads were gone. The following June, the whole row came up leafy and blank while my neighbour's identical plants carried a fence line of blue over the property boundary. It took me the better part of a decade of quiet annoyance to connect that empty summer to the tidy cut I had been so proud of. My early gardening years went to annuals as well, tearing out flats of spent petunias every autumn and buying them all over again in spring, so a shrub that could hold colour for years felt like a gift fumbling in the dark. The confusion comes down to two rules, living inside one plant name. Some hydrangeas want your hands off them in late summer. Others you can cut hard without losing a thing. Sort your plants into those two camps and the fear simply disappears. Therefore, the place to start is the wiring itself, the part your grandmother was never shown plainly, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Hydrangeas split into two flowering habits, and that split decides everything else. On one side are the old wood plants, the big leaf types, meaning those blue and pink mothheads, and the flat, delicate lace caps whose outer ring of florets frames a haze of tiny fertile flowers belong here. So do the mountain hydrangeas, the serrata types, smaller and hardier lace caps that shrug off a late frost better than their showy cousins. The oak leaf hydrangea belongs too, with its upright white summer cones, its cinnamon bark that peels in winter, and its lobed leaves that burn deep burgundy in the fall. So does the climbing hydrangea, which laces itself up a shaded brick wall on clinging roots and foams, white in early summer once it finally settles in. Every one of those flowers on old wood, the buds form on stems that already grew earlier this same season, and from that point the buds simply wait, carried along the stem through everything the calendar throws at them. The timing is what makes August so dangerous for these plants. An old wood hydrangea begins setting next year's flower buds around the 1st of August, right when the plant looks finished for the year and the tidy-minded gardener reaches for the shears. Once set, those buds have to be carried roughly 9 months, straight through fall colour, through the weight of winter snow, through the raw grey end of early spring, before they finally open the following June or July. Snip those stems any time after the start of August, and you are not shaping a bush. You are lifting next summer's flowers clean off the plant before they had a chance to open. If you are unsure which type you own, the tell is simple. A hydrangea that blooms in early summer, roughly June into July, and sulks after a hard winter is almost always an old wood plant. One that waits until mid to late summer and never seems to care how cold the winter was is playing by the other set of rules. That other camp plays those rules in reverse. Panicle hydrangeas, the ones with the tall, creamy cones that age to rose and parchment, and the smooth hydrangeas, meaning the round, white Annabelle types. Both flower on new wood. On growth, the plant pushes out fresh, in the very spring that it blooms. Because those flowers ride on wood that does not yet exist in August, nothing you do to the old stems in late summer can touch next year's show. You prune those too in late winter while they sleep. Cut them back hard if you like, and they answer with a full flush every year, no matter how brutal the winter was. Therefore, a cut now costs the panicle and the smooth almost nothing, while the identical cut on a big leaf is a whole year erased. Now walk out to an old wood plant and look closely at a single stem, because where the bud actually sits is a detail almost no one bothers to explain. The primary flower bud, the plant's first choice, forms at the very tip of the stem, the highest point of this year's growth. Lower down, tucked into the leaf axils, where each pair of leaves meets the stem, sit smaller backup buds. Those lower buds are the plant's insurance policy. If the tip bud survives winter and opens into a flower, the backups stay asleep and never fire. They only wake and bloom if the tip is killed by cold, stepping in at the last moment to save some of the season. Run your fingers up a stem in late autumn and you can often feel it, that fatter, rounder swelling right at the top where next June's flower already sits waiting, plumper than the slim buds strung along below it. Consider what that means for the most common cut in the garden. When you shear the tops off a big leaf hydrangea to neaten its shape, you are not trimming stray growth off the edges. You are slicing straight through the exact spot where the primary buds live, taking the plant's first choice flowers and leaving it holding only the emergency backups. A gentle shaping haircut, the most innocent looking cut you can imagine, turns out to be the single most damaging thing you can do to a moped in late summer. Therefore, the instinct to tidy the top is precisely backwards, and I have a flowerless June burned into my memory to prove it. Everything up to here still assumes the buds are the whole story. They are not. The flowers are not made at the stem tip alone. They are made in a very real sense by the leaves, and this is the part that quietly reframes the entire month of August. Researchers took big leaf hydrangeas grown under the cool, short days that trigger flowering, and they began removing leaves in a careful, deliberate way to see which ones actually mattered. When they stripped off just the upper 3 pairs of leaves and left everything below them, flowering nearly collapsed, with only about 1 plant in 10 managing to set a single bloom. When they instead removed the lower 3 pairs and left the top of the plant intact, close to 9 in 10 plants flowered normally. The upper leaves, it turned out, were the ones carrying the signal. And when they took 6 pairs of leaves off, enough to strip the working canopy, not one plant flowered at all, against a full flush on the untouched controls where every last plant bloomed. Read that result back to yourself slowly, because it changes how you look at a pair of shears forever. The upper leaves are the part of the plant that senses the turning season and sends the chemical message that flips the shrub over from making leaves to making flowers. So an August haircut does 2 separate kinds of damage in one stroke. It cuts off the tips where the buds are already forming, and it strips away the very leaves that were about to tell the plant to build those buds in the first place. You are not simply removing the flowers, you are firing the messenger who was already on the way to order them. Leaving that late summer canopy alone is the plant working, and your only task in August is to stand back and let it finish. There is a stubborn instinct worth correcting here, because I carried it myself for a long time. It feels natural to assume those buds are somehow built by the August heat, forged in the hottest, brightest stretch of the summer. That is not what switches them on. The real trigger is light. What actually tips an old wood hydrangea into flower mode is the shortening of the days and the cooling of late summer and autumn nights. A short day, cool night response, the plant quietly counting the shrinking hours of daylight and registering the drop in temperature after dark. Your hydrangea is reading the calendar by the length of the day, not by the thermometer at noon. That is why the process begins in that deceptive window when the afternoons are still blazing, but the evenings have only just started to stretch their shadows out longer across the lawn. The heat is not building anything, the fading light is. That one correction rearranges the picture because it tells you the plant is already hard at work on next year, during the exact weeks you felt most tempted to cut it back. 2 things protect all of that hidden work through late summer, and the first is water. This is where I want to be careful not to oversell it to you. Drought stress during bud set does not flip an all-or-nothing switch. A dry August will not usually wipe your entire bloom out to nothing. What it does instead is thin the count, leaving you with noticeably fewer flower buds carried into next year than a well-watered plant would set, and it leaves the shrub far more open to spider mites, powdery mildew, and scorched brown leaf edges on top of the flowers you lost. Reduced, not erased. That is the honest frame, and any video promising you certain doom from one dry week is selling you fear you do not need. So treat August watering not as an emergency rescue you perform once the plant is already wilting, but as guarding an investment the plant is quietly making in those stems. By the time the leaves droop in the afternoon heat, you've already missed the better window. Aim for a deep soaking of about an inch of water a week when the rain does not do it for you, delivered slow and low at the base of the plant so it actually reaches the roots, rather than a quick overhead sprinkle that only dampens the surface and burns off by lunchtime. A soaker hose coiled under the mulch does this better than any watering can. Push a finger down into the soil a few inches before you water, because a hydrangea can wilt in blazing sun with plenty of moisture underneath, and watering a plant that is already wet invites root rot that mimics the very drought you were trying to fix. Do the soaking in the morning so the leaves dry through the day and mildew never gets a grip. And keep a 3 to 4 inch ring of mulch, shredded bark, or fall leaves spread over the root zone to hold that moisture between waterings, pulled back just slightly so it never smothers the crown. A slow soak at the base at dawn, week after quiet week, is you standing guard over flowers that are already being built inside those stems. The twist that rewrites the flat rule for a huge share of modern gardens begins with a school teacher in Minnesota. Around 1981, a man named Dennis Bostrom, out in Cottage Grove near St. Paul, ordered a Nico Blue bigleaf hydrangea from a mail-order nursery and planted it in a sheltered, heavily mulched corner of his yard. By every reasonable expectation, that plant had almost no business surviving the brutal Zone 4 winters up there. But it lived, and by the July of its second year, it was blooming. It turned out to be a genetic sport, a chance mutation that flowered on both old wood and new wood, which meant that even in the years a hard winter killed the tips right off, the plant bloomed on its fresh growth anyway and handed him flowers regardless of the cold. A few years on, Bostrom showed the odd survivor to his neighbor down the road, Vern Black, a production man at Bailey Nurseries. Black knew at a glance he was looking at something he had never seen before, and he carried cuttings back to the Bailey greenhouse where the plant was propagated and tested across most of 10 years in that same unforgiving Minnesota climate, to be sure the reblooming and the hardiness would hold. Then, in September of 1998, a University of Georgia horticulture professor named Michael Durr was touring Bailey's test field in St. Saint Paul and stopped dead in front of these hydrangeas standing in full bloom, a reblooming trait in a big leaf he had chased for years and never once seen in the flesh. On the flight home, he scribbled a name into his notebook by the window, 2 words, endless summer. He would later say it was clear to him on the spot that the trait would change the hydrangea market for good. It launched in the spring of 2004 as the first reblooming big leaf hydrangea the world had ever sold, and it went on to become one of the best-selling shrubs in the entire history of the nursery trade. That is the reason the flat old command, "Never cut your hydrangeas," no longer binds the way it once did for so many gardens. For endless summer and the rebloomers that came after it, names like Blushing Bride, Twist, and Shout, Bloomstruck, and Popstar, and August Cut is far more forgiving, because those plants flower on new wood as well and can rebuild a bloom the old-fashioned mopheads never could. Check the tag your plant came with. If it came home from a garden centre in the last 20 years, promising blooms all season long, there is a real chance the old rule was quietly repealed for your plant back in that St. Centra. Poor field, and you have been living in fear of shears you could have relaxed around all along. If you want more of these, the kind that explain the plant's wiring instead of just barking a rule at you, subscribe. Now to the one hydrangea that broke the old rule long before any breeder got involved. The Panicle hydrangea earns its place as the safe exception, and the reason is written right into where it came from. Panicles are native to colder, higher country than the pampered mopheads, up on the mountain slopes of Japan and China, some of them growing wild, as loose open trees 15 to 25 feet tall on rugged ground, thousands of feet up, where winter comes down hard and early. A plant that tried to set its flower buds on old wood in that kind of cold would lose the whole lot to the freeze most years. So the Panicle adapted its way straight out of the problem. It gave up flowering on old wood altogether and learned to flower on the current year's growth instead, building its blooms fresh each spring only after the danger of hard cold has safely passed. That old evolutionary detour is exactly why the panicle is so dependable in your border, and the same reason you can cut it hard without a shred of worry. Those tall, creamy cones that open in July and August and slowly flush to pink and soft parchment through the fall are riding on brand new wood every time. You can spot a panicle at a glance by that shape alone, a pointed pyramid of bloom rather than the round ball of a mophead or the flat plate of a lace cap, held on stems stiff enough to take full sun where a big leaf would scorch and wilt. Come late winter, while the plant stands bare and fully dormant, cut it back by about a third to a strong, low framework of stems, and it will surge straight back and bloom heavier for the cut. Thin the plant to 5 or 10 main shoots if you want fewer, larger cones rather than a crowd of smaller ones. This is the old peagy hydrangea, the grandiflora your grandmother may have trained as a small standard tree beside the porch, and its modern children like Limelight, Pinky Winky, and Little Lime hold their heads up through a downpour and ride out winters cold enough to kill a mophead to the ground. The plant that evolved to shrug off a mountain winter is not going to lose any sleep over your pruning saw in February. If you own only one hydrangea and you want to prune it without a second thought, this is the plant to plant. The smooth hydrangea, the white Annabelle so many of us grew up with, plays the same new wood game and gives you the same freedom. One detail about this plant surprises people. Unlike the big leaf and the panicle, which sailed over from Asia, the smooth hydrangea is a true native of the eastern United States, a woodland plant that grew on shaded stream banks and rocky slopes here long before anyone put it in a border. Those big round heads open pale lime green in June, whiten into soft balls of bloom, then dry to tan and stand right through the fall. You can cut the whole plant nearly to the ground in late winter, and it will come roaring back the same summer. The one trick worth knowing is to leave a low framework of last year's stems, about knee-high, instead of shearing it flat to the soil, because those old stems act like a cage that props the enormous heads up after a downpour, rather than letting them flop face down into the mud. If flopping has always been your Annabelle's curse, look at the newer strong stem selections bred to hold those heavy heads upright, without any staking at all. That single choice, an old framework or a firmer cultivar, is the difference between a plant that stands proud after a summer storm and one that sprawls across the path. It is worth pausing on that native thread because it upends a tidy assumption. You might expect the American natives to be the tough new wood plants and the delicate Asian imports to be the fussy old wood ones. It does not sort that neatly. The oak leaf hydrangea is also a proud native of the American Southeast, and it is one of the finest four-season shrubs you can own, with its white early summer cones, its wine-red autumn foliage, and that peeling cinnamon bark for the bleak months. Yet the oak leaf flowers firmly on old wood, right alongside the imported big leaf, which means nativity tells you nothing about the safe time to prune. The oak leaf and the climbing hydrangea are, if anything, the slowest of all to forgive a bad cut, because both are unhurried growers that take a few seasons to build the wood a good bloom needs. Prune those two wrong, and you are not waiting one summer for your flowers to return. You may be waiting 2 or 3. With them more than any other, the honest advice is to keep the shears away almost entirely and let the plant find its own graceful shape. While the old wood plants are holding next year's buds through winter, do them one more favor and leave the spent blooms standing. Those faded brown mophead and oak leaf heads catch the frost on a cold morning and hold little caps of snow through the quiet months, giving the winter border something to look at when everything else has gone to sticks. They also offer the tender tip buds, just below them a small measure of shelter from the worst of the wind and cold, an extra scrap of insulation over the very flowers you are trying to protect. The seed heads feed the odd hungry bird through a lean winter as well, and the whole plant reads as intentional rather than neglected, once the frost silvers every dried petal. Resist the urge to strip the shrub bare and tidy in November. Wait, and let those spent heads earn their keep right through to spring, when you clear them off just above the swelling buds and start the whole cycle over again. A practical rule lets you tidy the old wood plants without paying for it next June. If you truly cannot stand the sight of the spent brown heads on a big leaf or an oak leaf all winter, you are allowed one careful cut. Snip only just above the first pair of healthy leaves sitting directly below the old flower, and stop there, going no lower than that. Next year's buds are already sitting on the nodes just beneath that point, so a shallow cut lifts the dead head away while leaving the flowers in waiting completely untouched. The worn book cover on my potting bench has earned its keep on cuts this fussy over exactly this many years. That one calendar page covered. The Flower Gardener's Bible lays out the full month-by-month schedule by hardiness zone. $9 at bloomrelay.co. Keep that web address in your spring notes, because spring is when the second half of this really matters. One identification move saves you every time you are tempted to guess. On an old wood plant, do not prune anything at all until you can actually see the fat buds swelling in spring, sometimes as late as June in the coldest gardens, looking for all the world like tiny pale green heads of broccoli pushing right off last year's wood. Only once those show themselves do you truly know which stems came through winter alive. Rushing this is the second great hydrangea mistake, right behind the August cut. A stem can look dead as a stick in April and still be holding a live bud that will not show itself for weeks. So the gardener who cleans up early in the name of neatness often cuts away the very wood that was about to flower. If you are still not sure a bare stem is worth keeping, drag a thumbnail down the bark. Green and moist underneath means live wood, holding a bud. Brown, dry and brittle means the stem is gone. And only that one should come off, snipped back to the first point where you find green, or all the way to the base if the whole cane is dead. Work up from the bottom, cutting only what the scratch test condemns, and stop the moment you reach live wood. On the rebloomers, the endless summer crowd, you can be a touch braver, since a cane you cut too far will still throw a bloom on new growth later in the season. On a plain old moth head or an oak leaf, one careless snip is a flower gone until the summer after next. Prune before the broccoli buds appear and you are gambling blind. Wait for them and the plant tells you plainly which wood to keep and which to clear. Step back now and the trap comes into focus at last. The empty summer always arrives about 10 months after the cut that caused it. And that long, quiet delay is the entire reason almost nobody ever connects the flowerless June back to the shears in August. The cause and the consequence stand 2 full seasons apart, so the lesson never lands on its own. It took me a flowerless row and years of plain stubbornness to finally see the thread running between them, and the moment I saw it, I stopped losing summers for good. You do not have to learn it the slow, expensive way I did. Learn the wiring one time and the fear turns into a single, simple decision at the shed door. Hands off this plant through winter, or cut that one freely while it sleeps. The plant was never being difficult with you. It has been telling you all along in bud position and leaf and bloom month. You only ever needed someone to sit down and translate. So now you have the full map. You know that some hydrangeas carry next year's bloom on this year's wood and cannot forgive an August cut, while others build their flowers fresh each spring and hardly notice the shears at all. You know the fattest bud sits at the growing point up top, that the leaves gathered around it are the ones calling the flower into being, and that shortening light rather than August heat is what starts the clock ticking. Next June, when the swelling buds break like little green broccoli along the old canes, a single walk down the border will tell you which stems to trust and which to clear away. That is the distance between a bare green bush by the gate and a path lined with heavy blue heads nodding after the rain. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe, and I will meet you back here in the next border.